In the prehistoric times when mainframes roamed the earth, our servers were lumbering beasts. Monolithic apps stood still, trapped in their iron confines. Then, on the horizon appeared a comet called Virtualization. When the dust settled, the time of the dinosaurs was over, and a new, agile, adaptable creature had taken its place, the virtual machine. But time and tide wait for no man, and our technology timeline continues to march on. Next over the horizon, I think we all see the weather getting cloudy. Hey everyone, welcome to the AnexiPod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 21, recorded August 21st, 2017. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions at Anexinet. Here on the AnexiPod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we will be talking about virtualization, private cloud, and more with Paul Galjan, the Senior Director for Microsoft Hybrid Cloud at Dell EMC. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks a bunch, Ned. Really pleased to be here today.
Awesome. So, Paul, before we dive into the topics, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what exactly a Senior Director of Microsoft Hybrid Cloud means?
That's a great question. Exactly what I do here at Dell EMC. But I have been on the EMC side of Dell EMC for it's probably about 10 years now, and I've been primarily in field-facing roles, but working with our solutions groups to create application-oriented offerings for things like SQL Server and Exchange and SharePoint for about those 10 years. And, when Azure Stack came on the horizon, and even before that, we had started working on reference architectures for the predecessors for Azure Stack, like Windows Azure Pack, and even before that, just simple Hyper-V solutions. Mm-hmm. So I've been pretty close to the Microsoft side of things for the entirety of my career here at AMC. And around the beginning of the year, this incredible opportunity came up to be the business lead for our Azure Stack offering, and that's what the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud aspect of it comes in. And so I'm the leader of the group. I have an engineering group as well as a product management group that we all work together to get our Azure Stack offerings out into the market. And in addition, we have all of the things that go along with that. Our technical marketing, our customer experience teams, and pre-sales engineering and sales. All of those roles are part of the ecosystem as well. But ultimately, I'm responsible. I'm just the business lead, kind of the general manager for our Azure Stack offerings.
Okay. All right. Makes sense. Yeah, sometimes that transition from a technical role into a sort of business, non-technical role can be a little bumpy. How was it for you? Was it pretty smooth?
It has been just every day I learn something new. And part of it is, just the product management aspect of it and the life cycle supply chain type stuff that comes along with engineering a hardware offering that should be orderable for years, and particularly within the constraints of of kind of an appliance type offering. That's been really neat, but luckily, on the team we have just such great team members with just tons of experience engineering things, both in the context of an appliance, whether that's like a vPlex offering or something like that, or vMax. But we also have people who have been working on cloud, both in the context of VMware and Microsoft for years. So it's been really, really helpful. The biggest transition is that the team is so big, and the experiences are so diverse that there's a ton of people that you just don't know where you'd be without them, and it's just really great to be part of that big team, all working toward what's turned out to be a very focused goal. Whereas in the past, it was really a portfolio. How do we've got SharePoint and how do we help customers deal with, large SharePoint farms. And then the next conversation would be, okay, we've got this Hyper-V disaster recovery thing that we want to work on and help this customer be successful when we go off and do that. This role is very, very tightly focused. And so it's just been quite a learning experience,
Well, it's good to learn something new, right? You don't want
Absolutely.
to stay
still. It's been really, really fun the last 8-10 months.
Awesome.
So
the genesis for this conversation was a blog post you made, which became a chain of replies on Twitter. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but could you summarize sort of the main points of the blog post a bit?
So that blog post, it turned out, it was started by kind of an internal email thread about how to position Azure Stack and what it does and doesn't do. And a lot of it also has to do with, say, Microsoft's positioning of Azure Stack. And a lot of people, less now than, say, 6 months ago, a lot of people were really looking at it through the lens of existing offerings in the market, which is, you bring to bear all the experiences that you have, but Azure Stack is something quite different in a lot of respects than a traditional, on-premises virtualization stack that you might add self-service on or something like that. And so that blog was really, here's where to talk about Azure Stack and here's how to talk about Azure Stack. And I was really discouraging people from really thinking about it just purely through the lens of, I think I used the term virtual machine dispenser, which I shamelessly stole from one of the product managers over at Microsoft, because it's so much more than that. My point with Azure Stack is that if you're just looking for something to provision out virtual machines, you have a ton of different offerings out there that will do exactly that and have been doing exactly that for years now, whether that's, based on hyper-converged with, your SimpliVities and Nutanix and VxRails, or even converged offerings that are based on something like a vBlock from Dell EMC. That aspect of what Azure Stack offers is familiar to customers, but it's also not necessarily why you buy Azure Stack. And those IaaS offerings that are out there, I would say, just kind of virtualization offerings, are really, because they've been in market for such a long time, they're very feature rich, they're very mature, they have there are a lot of things within the ecosystem to solve particular problems, and they've been able to move down market over time. Our VxRail offerings are really inexpensive from an entry price point perspective. Whereas with Azure Stack, because it's an integrated system top to bottom, including network, including management, the price point is a bit higher than what you might find if all you were looking for was pure virtualization. And so I encourage people to think about it in the sense of a pure cloud, right? This is a hybrid cloud that has all of the features that you'd come to expect, or at least most of the features that you'd come to expect a cloud to provide. So that's really it. Okay,
great. So there's a lot of terms that gets thrown around, virtualization versus IaaS versus PaaS. Mm-hmm. So, and people sometimes use them interchangeably, especially virtualization, private cloud, and IaaS. I feel like for some people, those are all the same thing, and other people are like, no, those are three completely separate things. So where would you sort of draw that line of delineation between virtualization, IaaS, and then a private cloud offering like Azure Stack?
That's a great question. I would, so with virtualization, it's very clear. You're really just putting a layer in between your physical hardware and your operating environment that you make accessible to your clients, whether that's a server administrator, application administrator, or whatever. You're really just pooling some of those resources. And virtualization is a key component of cloud, but it does not provide everything that you would need to have what people would call a a cloud offering. And NIST has actually defined what a cloud is, luckily. And so it includes things like self-service, virtual networking, or what they would call broad network access, the resource pooling and elasticity, which are facilitated by virtualization. And then there's the other aspect of it that's metered. Three of those components that go into the NIST definition are not necessarily part of a virtual machine environment.
Right.
It's really just that resource pooling, and there you're virtualized. So it's a superset of virtualization, not a virtualization is a subset of cloud.
Right. Yeah. So the thing that I come back to is there's like a Gartner report that looked at how many people think that they're running private cloud, and then how do they define it. And a lot of them define just a standard VMware installation as their private cloud without realizing that there's a lot of components missing that you sort of referenced in that NIST definition, that sort of that self-service, the metering, some of the elasticity that doesn't necessarily exist in a virtualized environment. You're really just getting that abstraction of the hardware layer.
Yeah, that's right, Ned. When you take that NIST definition and you put it into practical terms, you'll start seeing what the difference between IaaS, infrastructure as a service, what I would call cloud infrastructure as a service, and bare virtualization. There's concepts and constructs like virtual machine scale sets, containers, and being able to put containers and manage them, the virtual networking and the virtual load balancing and VPN, and then the storage stuff, whether that's object, blob storage, tables, queues. All of those things are part of an IaaS offering. Now you can layer that on a virtual environment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's included. And what's really, what I would say is not dangerous, but it's a bit of a pitfall to call virtualization cloud, because your customers, the people that you're provisioning these offerings to, have a pretty well-defined expectation of what cloud is.
Right.
And if you're just offering virtual machines that are like, well, this isn't a cloud, and then they go swipe their credit card for, Google Compute or AWS or Azure, and you're really damaging your credibility when you don't call what you're offering, right? When you have an expectation mismatch with your customers.
Yeah, I think 5 years ago, you could have gotten away with it because enough people weren't familiar with public cloud offerings, so they didn't necessarily have those expectations. But yeah, nowadays, so many people are familiar with how the public cloud works, and if you say I have a private cloud, they're like, okay, I should be able to do the same things or the same type of things with your private cloud.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that actually increasingly refers to the platform as a service offerings that are available in public cloud. And I just kind of rattled through a bunch of IaaS type components, but with Azure Stack, you have the platform as a service offerings that are either already built into Azure Stack and you can go around and play with in the Azure Stack development kit right now, or are coming very soon. Things like Cloud Foundry, app services, the serverless computing like Azure Functions. All those things are built into Azure Stack, and more is coming soon. So that at least gets you to the point where you can properly call this a cloud, whether it's private, hybrid, or public. Right.
You made a comparison in the post of Azure Stack as a vending machine is a bit like, what do you say, using a F-350 diesel to drive around New York City. Sure, it's going to get you where you need to go, but it's not necessarily the best way to go about it. And for the purposes of this episode, I'm going to assume that listeners already know at least a foundation of what's going on in Azure Stack. If they don't, I did an episode with Datanauts a couple weeks ago all about it, so I'll throw that in the show notes. But can you expand on that F-350 and NYC idea a little?
Yeah, I live in Connecticut, and I get down to the city every now and again, and usually I take the train. But I don't know if you've ever tried to park in New York. It's a bit of a bear if you've got a truck. But it really is. I suppose that a better comparison, not to back off of that analogy, but maybe a more apt analogy would be like driving an RV in New York.
Wow.
Where you have all of this stuff in the back. You've got a stove, you've got a shower, you've got beds. If you're not going to use those things, if all you're using is transportation, then perhaps a car would be better, or perhaps even Uber would be better than that, or a cab. You'd consume it as a service from somebody else who owns the infrastructure, right? So it's really just kind of an elaborate way of saying that this is overkill. If all you're looking to do is dispense virtual machines, an Azure Stack is probably overkill for what you're attempting to do. Now, that having been said, if your eventual goal is to get an Azure consistent infrastructure as a service, and you're starting out with Azure Stack, and you want to expand that, and your strategic goal is to align your provisioning and the interface that you make available to your consumers, whether that's via API or via the web portal, then Azure Stack is a good way to do it. In fact, it's the only way to do it. It's the only way to get, that Azure consistent experience across private and public clouds.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, when they first sign up to try out Azure or any public cloud, the first thing that they tend to do, especially if they're an infrastructure admin, is spin up a VM because they want to see what that experience looks like. And that might not be their end goal, but like you said,
right.
You have a different end goal in mind, but you're just trying to get a taste for how things work, then it's totally legitimate to use it as a VM vending machine, but that shouldn't be your end game.
Right. If the end game is just VM vending machine, then there's a ton of other really, really robust offerings out there that can get you where you're going pretty easily.
Right, exactly. And so some of those on-premise solutions that you were talking about, sort of like VxRail and I guess Nutanix would be another one. Those are all around the hyperconverged sphere, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It's very hyperconverged, and they share some features, some design features, obviously, with Azure Stack, which is really hyperconverged focused as well in and of itself.
Right. And as you alluded to, Azure Stack has a lot of capabilities beyond just IaaS. In fact, I mean, we've already started talking about it like it's a private cloud or an extension of Azure, right? I think that's the official messaging from Microsoft. It's an extension of Azure, which is a very pleasant visual, I guess. Does that all pass muster with you? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that that's a really good way to differentiate between what you might find with VxRail or Nutanix or SimpliVity or something like that, or even something that you'd roll your own with the vSphere suite, or even if you rolled your own with the Microsoft virtualization offerings that include, System Center, Virtual Machine Manager, and all that. You can add a lot of those capabilities. Like, for example, you can run containers on your virtualized infrastructure. You can, make object storage available to your virtualized infrastructure and do a lot of those things. And there are even some open source serverless function things that you can add to a virtual infrastructure, but you're doing that integration. With Azure Stack, all of that is built in, and it has consistency with public Azure.
Right, and so, I mean, some of the services that immediately come to mind is sort of the SQL database as a service. That doesn't exist in virtualization land, but it's something you build on top of it. Right.
In fact, we've done that here at Dell EMC with some of our other offerings. I think that the other thing that I would focus on, and this is something that doesn't generally get a lot of press, is the Azure Marketplace. The Azure Marketplace, just being able to define an offering and then syndicate that to customers to make it available on premises is really, I think that's going to revolutionize how both customers consume software as well as how ISVs, software vendors, whether that's Microsoft themselves or whether that's SAP or Pivotal or whomever, it will really revolutionize how they go to market as well, how they make their offerings available to customers.
Right. So if I'm an ISV and I'm looking to develop a solution, what is that impact? What do you see as the approach forward? If I already have an Azure solution, do you know what the process is for getting it part of Azure Stack?
Sure. So the Azure marketplace is pretty well defined right now, and in fact, one of the Dell Technologies companies is the number one driver of Azure consumption through the marketplace. And that's via Pivotal Cloud Foundry.
Okay, yeah.
And yeah, so basically what you do is you create an offering within the marketplace. It consists of, a set of virtual machines, the virtual networking, object services, and things like that might be associated to enable that offering. And then you define that and you make it available in the Azure Marketplace for people to come check out and deploy on their own. So if you think about how a Pivotal Cloud Foundry deployment on your own works, if you were to do it on your own infrastructure, you would go out and you would go get the deployment guide from Pivotal, and you would go create all the virtual machines, the several dozen virtual machines that are necessary that create a Cloud Foundry AI. With Azure Stack, you go and you check out you subscribe to it from the Azure Marketplace, and everything gets configured for you according to some of the parameters that you set up front. And so from the consumer perspective, it makes it very, very simple, because those are things that I no longer have to do. I don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, how big does this virtual machine need to be? What does it need to talk to? Are my firewall rules in place? Right. Does it need an object store? What kind of buckets does that look like, right? So I don't have to think about that from a consumer perspective. And also it enables a lot, some really interesting financial models. Like if I'm done with, when I'm done with that AI, I can just delete it, right? I'm done paying for it. So that pay-as-you-go model is really interesting for a lot of customers. From an ISV perspective, it gets really cool because I am no longer having to, for a customer that consumes something through a marketplace, I have control over that configuration. And if I decide that, okay, we've made some changes to this application that either reduce or increase the resource needs of a particular component within Cloud Foundry. So what can I do? Well, I just go to the Azure Stack Marketplace and I modify the offering within the marketplace. And it makes it by providing a predictable deployment process, it makes it very, very attractive to ISVs, and it can really reduce the support complexity.
Right.
And so I think that, in addition to all the pay-as-you-go type models, which are equally interesting to software vendors.
Right. I mean, so as a consultant, I've done countless POCs, right? And sometimes the hardest part of a POC is fighting with the customer's infrastructure and trying to get all the resources you need to deploy it properly.
Yeah.
And the idea of being able to, hey, you want to take this for a test drive? Sure, no problem. Go add it as a syndication in your Azure Stack Marketplace, plug in some parameters, and away you go. And I'll help you through learning more about the system itself, but I'm not spending the first half of that engagement just getting stuff running.
That's right. And obviously from that perspective, the hardware, locating hardware to do it, is very simple. It's already there. You don't have to go out and procure it, configure it, or kind of gather it up from spare capacity that you might have in your data center. The other thing that's really interesting about Azure Stack, though, with syndication is really that is very cool. But the Azure Stack itself, you mentioned about how to do a POC. Now, if we were to do a POC or a deployment of Azure Stack, or any cloud platform today, you would get a core infrastructure, whether that's hyper-converged or converged or rolled together on your own, and you would go look at all the installation guides and make sure that you've got the right compatibility between all the software and hardware components, and you'd go then deploy it, and then after that you would start layering on use cases and applications on top of it. Whereas with Azure Stack, that's very different. I mentioned earlier at the top of the show that that it's an integrated system, top to bottom. The top of rack switches come with the servers, which comes with the hardware lifecycle host, and so on and so forth. And when you show it on a slide, it looks like a rack. It looks like a rack of servers, which in fact it is.
Right.
But the deployment model is very different. The deployment of an Azure Stack is almost entirely automated. So there is no configuring the switches. There is no, I need these ACLs on port 3, and I need the firmware of the motherboard on this set to, version 3.25. All of that is completely taken care of. And that responsibility is shifted to Microsoft as well as the OEM. So when you go deploy an Azure Stack, it is deployed as an integrated system. The switches are configured with all the right ports and the things set up. The software-defined storage is set up in a particular way. The servers themselves in Hyper-V, which is a hidden component within Azure Stack, that's set up in a very particular way that is both predictable, which is attractive to Microsoft and Dell EMC from a support perspective, but it also takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. So being deployed as an integrated system, that's very cool. But then it's also the life cycle of it is managed by Microsoft and the vendor. Although you choose when to update when to update Azure Stack, the actual deployment of the necessary firmware to support the latest version of Azure Stack, that is all packaged up by my team, frankly. If you purchase through Dell EMC, we package up all of the firmware that is necessary for that, and you deploy it, and you deploy it as an integrated system. So that life cycle, the ongoing task of, ensuring compatibility, that's all taken care of by the OEM. And Microsoft then also has their own update process, which will update Azure Stack itself. So that life cycle management, which is a significant portion of the overall cost of a system, that's largely managed by both Microsoft and the OEM that you choose to purchase from. So it is very interesting. I think for customers who have not done hyperconverged before, this is a familiar refrain for anybody who's done hyperconverged.
Right.
That's how it works. What will be new is the fact that the network is managed as part of the integrated system, and so that 10 years ago, it was I had our server guy and I had our storage guy and our network guy. And now the server and storage in a hyperconverged environment, those are all kind of collapsed into one. And then in this case, the network is converged as well. So it's something that I don't think a lot of people expect when they're ordering an Azure Stack. They say, well, that's a Cisco switch or that's a Dell switch. I'll go in and configure it. And you're not really going to be able to do that.
Right. I'd refer to it as a black box. This is the black box, and you put these inputs in, you get these outputs out, but you don't touch any of the levers that are in there. That's all obscured for your own good. I know because I've done a number of hyperconverged installations, and like you said, the software-defined storage is already done. The compute is pretty much already done. It runs an automation wizard, but the thing that you always have the most trouble with is making sure that the client has set up their network appropriately. That's always a tripping point. They either don't have the right switches, the ports aren't configured correctly. There's just any number of things that can go terribly wrong quickly. And so to know that if they purchase an Azure Stack system, it has all of the networking built in. It has the switches already properly configured to support RDMA and all the other goodness that's in there. That's huge. That's all you got to do is get it to integrate with the existing networking, and that's it.
Yeah, and it's not quite a black box because there is the ability to monitor. So we ship with OpenManage, so you have the ability to plug into OpenManage and pull data from the componentry within it, so you can get your SNMP and all that and monitor the health of the system. But you're absolutely right. The configuration is not going to be that's all managed through the context of Azure Stack itself within the Azure Stack administrative portal.
Right. Something that I had a question about, and I don't know if you know the answer to this. The purchasers of Azure Stack, do they even get credentials to log into the Hyper-V hosts, or is that abstracted away from them as well?
I don't know the answer to that. So in the early days, you might log into Hyper-V Manager to do some troubleshooting. I'm not seeing that very much anymore.
Right.
And I don't think that – I think that aspirationally that will be removed if it hasn't been already. So –
Right. My understanding is that the Azure public cloud level, they don't have access, or at least the Azure administration team doesn't have access to the Hyper-V console at all. So they have to do all their troubleshooting remotely.
Yeah.
And, that's partly for the safety of the tenants, saying, "Hey, I can't even get into your virtual machine." So
it's that's part of it, and I think part of it is also enforcing just good practice. If there's something that you need to do via Hyper-V Manager or via PowerShell directly into the hypervisor, and it's not available from the Azure Administrative Portal, then that's something that needs to be put into the engineering backlog for the Azure Administrative Portal.
Right.
Kind of going around and doing an end around so that you can kind of facilitate it. That can help on a case-by-case basis, but ideally you want it all in the Azure admin portal.
Yeah, you don't want to end up with one of those Hyper-V hosts configured slightly differently than all the other hosts, and the next time you try to do an update, it just breaks on that host and you have no idea why. Yeah, that's right. Never a good thing.
Yeah.
So when Microsoft announced that Azure Stack would only be available from OEMs, I thought to myself, how are they going to differentiate their offerings? Because I imagine Microsoft has given some pretty strict guidelines on the hardware running Azure Stack and how it has to be configured. So how does one go about differentiating the offering when you go to market?
That's a very good question, and I think that you're going to see. It is the first question that everybody asked me first when I first joined this team and started leading it. It's like, well, it's some servers and it's some networking and off you go, right? So how is this different? And everything's managed, as I said, through the Azure admin portal. I mean, how are you going to differentiate? Well, the reality is that it's a chair with four legs, and the first leg is the platform itself. That is our networking and the platform on which we're basing this, which is our PowerEdge platforms. And we bring to bear a lot of experience, a lot of intellectual property into building that core platform. And things like OpenManage are critical to differentiating the core platform itself. But again, everybody has that, right? I mean, it's an Intel or AMD server or whatever, right. And then off you go. And, there's a lot of room for debate around who's got the best platform, who's got the best widgets in there. I think that as you start looking at, we were talking about the lifecycle management, this system looks more, from an operational perspective, it looks more like an appliance than a group of servers, right? The VMAX, the compellant, the NetApp filers, all of those are based on commodity componentry. The differentiation is in the software and the lifecycle management of it. And the software itself the core software is provided by Microsoft, but then that lifecycle management and being able to manage all of it, both within the context of one scale unit, but then what happens if you have 200 scale units? How do you manage that? So I have a lot of my engineering team is actually not focused on the hardware platform. A lot of them are, but we have a heavy focus on software development, which is, the automation of the management and deployment of Azure Stack itself. So we're going to differentiate ourselves that way when we ship later on this year. And I think that over time, people will see what you can do with a tightly integrated, highly automated platform, and how that can scale out and really result in a very different experience if you have, as I said, 200 scale units versus one scale unit. The other aspect that will be very difficult, I think, for some of our competitors to meet is the Dell Technologies portfolio. I already talked about Pivotal Cloud Foundry and how they're tightly partnered with Microsoft, with Azure. We also have a broad portfolio even within Dell EMC that we've already been talking about things like Secure VM, which is essentially encryption management, but it also allows things like geofencing for workloads, so that you can make sure that this one workload stays in this one region and doesn't move to another region, or they don't get the keys to start up that workload.
Right.
Things like backup, being able to integrate things like network or data domain within Azure Stack. These are things that are very, very that are very hard for. Well, not hard, but our competitors will have to partner, whereas we have resources in-house and intellectual property in-house that allow for not only quick and rapid integration, but also a very smooth support experience for our customers. And then the fourth leg of the chair is consulting services. And we have a very, very robust consulting offering that starts with just, here's your Azure Stack and here's how it gets integrated into your environment in your Active Directory. But then it goes on. You can use our consulting services to help decide how you're going to use it, help identify workloads that you're going to move, help you develop and replatform those workloads. So when I come into work and I think of myself in this kind of virtual garage of all the tools and things that I can add to my Azure Stack, I think about how fortunate I am because I have just the broadest tool set to differentiate Azure Stack. Right. And it's just really exciting.
Yeah, no, that's great. The 2 points that I really pulled out there is one, like you said, the hardware is somewhat commodity. It's Intel motherboards and chipsets or AMD. So really the key way to differentiate yourself is having outstanding software that enables something that you couldn't do before. So that's huge. And you mentioned the secure VM, and that just perks up my ears because a lot of the use cases I've heard around Azure Stack are when you're in an environment that can't be in the public cloud for regulatory reasons or compliance reasons or something like that. So the concept of a secure VM really piques my interest there. Can you dig into what is the secure VM solution?
So secure VM is essentially it is a key management system. It actually integrates with Azure Key Vault. It has its own key management system, and you can use external key stores or something like that if you'd like. It also integrates with Active Directory.
Okay.
But essentially what it does is it leverages BitLocker, or the encryption that's available within the Linux virtual machines, the kernel encryption that's built into Linux. But what differentiates it is not the actual encryption, it's the policy engine that's built into CloudLink. So CloudLink itself is a policy engine. So if I have a virtual machine, I can say, all right, well, this virtual machine right now, I can have it running anywhere in North America. And then some regulatory compliance requirement comes down from above, I can go in and I can say, well, that virtual machine is no longer available to run in the US, but only available to run in Canada. So I can have, when that virtual machine comes down to the US or whatever, and it tries to start up, it will go check with that policy engine. And the policy engine will decide, based on the policies that you set, whether the conditions under which that virtual machine can run have been satisfied. And so that can be linked to location, can be linked to, the scale unit or region. It can be linked to the Active Directory credentials, things like that. So it's a really very, very robust way. And this is something that I think is going to come really into its heyday with an environment like Azure Stack, where you actually, when you deploy to Azure, Azure Stack is just another region within Azure, within an Azure subscription. So you can actually genuinely get confused about, okay, is this US East? Is that US East for my company, or is that really the Azure US East?
Right.
And so makes it really easy to audit things. And I think it's going to be a real big differentiator.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I look forward to checking that out. So as an engineer, I like to verify claims in my own lab. If someone were looking to do a comparison or take a solution for a test drive, what are some ways that Dell EMC can help out with that?
Yeah, so we've already rolled out multi-node Azure Stack to a lot of the Microsoft Technology Centers worldwide.
Okay.
So you'll see them there. We also have them in the Dell Solution Centers, which are located around the world. And we also have the single node developer edition that you can procure on your own for actually not a lot of money. And so you can get the full Azure Stack experience without the multi-node, without the heavy footprint. You can get like 10 Azure Stack developer editions for the price of one, multi-node, because It doesn't include the network and things like that.
Right.
So it's a great way to kind of figure out, okay, how do I want to integrate with Active Directory? How do I, how do I manage my regions? Things like that can be answered really easily within a lab if you have a handful of these developer nodes.
Okay, very cool. So definitely want to check that out. Last question, I like to ask this for everyone. What is your favorite 80s movie?
So I'm going to tell you a little story. When I went to college, it was 1989, and that's seriously dating myself. But my roommate, I didn't know him before we moved into the dorm, but my roommate brought his dad's old Betamax with him, and we only had two movies, and one of them was Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and the other one was Spies Like Us. And we watched those things over and over and over again because we didn't have cable. We were the only ones with any kind of like VCR or anything like that. So I'm going to say Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Ooh, that was close.
Yeah.
I do like Spies Like Us a lot. That is a fantastic movie.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, awesome. Well, Paul Galjan, it was great to have you on the show. If people want to reach out to you and see what you're up to, what are some ways they can find you on the interwebs?
Oh, so I am on Twitter at Paul Galjan. So I tweet a lot. It's a mix of just kind of personal stuff, but a lot of tech stuff too. So that's a good way to follow me. I have not been blogging personally on my personal blog lately because we're in pre-release and all of that. You'll see that ramp up as we go GA with this thing. And so that's at flippingbits.typepad.com. There's just a few recent posts on Azure Stack there.
Okay.
And you'll find me on the Dell EMC blogs as well.
Okay, great.
From time to time.
All right, Paul Galjan, thank you so much for appearing.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that was our show with Paul Galjan. If you enjoyed the AnexiPod and are looking for more content, why not check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow? On the show, I am joined weekly by my co-host Chris Hayner and an assortment of other Anexinet colleagues to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. Thanks to the marketing team for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Lee Rosevere and Professor Click for providing the music for AnexiPod. Thanks to Anexinet for helping me produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital transformation, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet, see how they can help. If you'd like to know more about me and what I'm up to, you can check me out on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.